Hello, Dr. Harris, and we're looking at material out of Chapter 5 in our data computing class, the chapter on tidy data. I hope that you've already looked at the first slideshow in this chapter, which explains what tidy data is. Just a brief summary, a data set is in tidy form if every row in the set reflects a single case under study, and every entry in a column represents a value of a single variable. Of course, we could have NAs in the column as well, but only values of the variable or absences of any data at all can appear in any single column. So what we're going to do in the second slideshow, which is going to cover 3 different videos, is look at some ways that we can take data that's already tidy, but refashion it in a way that's going to be useful to us in different ways. So in terms of our picture, we're now looking at the outside this main box here, where we're looking at the tidy phase of our data computing. So we are going to be talking about reshaping data in this slideshow, in this set of videos. And there are 2 functions that we're going to be using. Our text in Chapter 5 uses 2 different functions from a different package that perform mostly the same sorts of things, but we're going to choose to use these commands from a package called tidyr. And so you'll need to make sure that you've libraried tidyr if you haven't done so already. And the 2 commands that we're going to be using are pivot_longer and pivot_wider. The corresponding functions in the text are gather and spread, but we're going to be using these pivot commands instead. So this video is going to deal with pivoting longer, gathering data. And so we could enter this data set into R by copying and pasting this into our console. And if we were to do so, we would get a table that looks akin to this. So we've got 3 individuals, all of whom have undergone some sort of fasting period, and we measured their weight before the fast and their weight after the fast and looked to see what the change in their weight was during the fasting period. And so this is in tidy form. We have each row representing a single case. We've got an individual and 2 weight measurements for them. But so we'll see that when this is called in wide form, where we have relatively few cases, but many variables for each case. And so if I wanted to mutate this data set by computing what the change in weight was for these individuals, I could add a new variable called diff, which is the after weight minus the before. And if I added that onto my table, I would see that April lost 5 pounds, Bishma lost 8, Carl lost 4 during the fasting period. And so when it's in a wide form, such as like this, it's mutate is great. We can just operate on columns. It's a great form for transformation functions. On the other hand, trying to draw this graph when it's in the wide form is actually going to turn out to be difficult. And so we're going to see how pivoting is going to allow us to generate this graphic. So let's see. And so hopefully by this time you've entered the library tidyr command, and the pivot longer data verb is going to look like this. It's going to have 3 arguments. There's going to be a calls variable that we need to assign values to, names _2 and values _2. So let's talk about this just a little bit. Calls equals whatever comes over here is going to refer to the columns that you are wanting to involve in your pivot. You're going to collect all of those variable names under a new categorical variable, which is going to be the argument for names to. We're going to call it when. So in this case, we're dealing with before and after. And then values to is going to create a new column that we're going to send our weights to in this particular case. And so we're going to have 3 columns when we're done. We'll see what this exclamation point name does in just a minute. So we've got calls, names to, and values to as arguments for the pivot longer function. And here's what we get if we were to do this for our fasting table. And notice what it does is it gathers the 2 variables before and after and makes a column. It makes a new variable where we have the value where those variables were, where the weights were before, and the corresponding weights have been moved into the weight column. And so each individual now appears twice. We have a before weight and an after weight. So this is what pivot longer does. And so the exclamation point here, we know means not. And so in this case, I'm saying we're going to work with all the variables that weren't name. And so not name is the set of columns that we're going to work with, which leaves us with before and after. And then when is going to be the new column heading where before and after go, and the weights are going to go to the column called weight. And so calls, as it says here, tells you which columns to gather together. And then names to just gives the heading for where all those columns are, the values in those columns are going to, or where the headings for those columns are going to. And then values to tells you gives you the column that where all the values are going to wind up. So a variant of what we did previously is, instead of being a little bit clever with the not name, we could just list out all the variables that are going to be gathered together, concatenating them with the C command. So we could do calls equals C before after. And those are the variable names. They're going to wind up in the column when, and then the corresponding weights will still go to weight. So this is just an alternate form for this command. And it might be better to try to just list all the variables rather than do a not, perhaps. And so what we want to notice is that when we gather together, we get our data in what's called a narrow form, where we've added cases. And so instead of a case being an individual along with 2 weight measurements, now each case is the person's name, when the weighing occurred, and what that weight was. So it's a single weighing act. So now let's try to generate the graphic that we saw earlier once we have it in this narrow form. And so our first pass is going to be using our data set fasting narrow, defining an aesthetic, and then, well, it seems like we plot points where we're going to color by name, and we're going to connect those points that are colored the same with a line. Well, it turns out this is not going to quite work. So let's go ahead and enter this into our studio. And the graphic we get are our points, but there's no lines. So, and that's what we see here. And we get this warning. Each group consists of only one observation. Do you need to adjust the group aesthetic? Group aesthetic. Well, let's see what we need to do here. So if we take a look at the innards of fasting narrow, we see that when is a categorical variable, and if that's our X aesthetic this time, when, geom line doesn't know how to gather groups, doesn't know what's being grouped together when the variable is categorical. So the way we fix that is we add a group aesthetic. So when we set our plot up, when we set what the X coordinate, what the X variable is going to be, what the Y variable is, and we also are going to group, tell how to group things together, and we're going to group by name. And then we still assign the colors by name and the aesthetics for geom point and geom line. And we see when we do that, we get this result. I'll prove it to you in RStudio if we copy and paste this. See, what we needed to do was group equals name. Generate it, and yes, the lines do go in. So the rest of this is just making it a little nicer looking. Let's label our axes a little bit better. So we'll use our labs. We'll add labs to this, labels. And so we get a label for the x-axis and the y-axis. And there we go. And that's our result here. So this is our brief introduction to pivot longer. Our next video will look at our other pivot command.